Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really complex story of belonging, erasure, and a historical collision that is absolutely still echoing today. We're looking at the 13 two-year history behind the Algerian French identity. If you've ever wondered how deep historical roots shape modern Europe, well, you're definitely in the right place. Okay, let's just dive right in with this quote because it perfectly frames the fractured duality we're exploring today. You're French when you score, Algerian when you don't. This sentiment gets echoed a lot in the world of French football when it comes to players of Algerian descent, and it captures this profound paradox. When a player wins, they're celebrated as the shining example of French integration. But the second they stumble, their immigrant heritage is suddenly front and center. It's this precarious balancing act of identity. And it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was forged over more than a century of conflict. Section 1. The Identity Paradox. Let's look at a historic cultural moment that brought this exact duality right to the center stage of Paris. Picture the scene for a second. It's September 1998. Thousands of people have packed into the Bercy Arena right in the heart of Paris for a monumental concert called 1, 2, 3 Soleils. You've got three absolute icons of Rai music, Cheb Khaled, Rachid Taha, and Fadel, taking the stage. For the marginalized Algerian immigrants in that crowd, this was pure magic. It was literally the sound of their identity echoing in the capital. For one night, they didn't feel like outsiders. They were the absolute center of French culture. The French hosts basically became guests in a space that was purely, joyously Algerian. But to really grasp why this brief moment of belonging was so revolutionary, we need to understand the centuries of alienation that came before it. Section 2. A Century of Erasure. To understand this modern search for belonging, we have to transition back to where the trauma really started, the colonization of Algeria. The methodical stripping of rights actually started with something incredibly trivial. Back in 1827, there was a dispute over unpaid debts, and the ruler of Algeria supposedly hit the French consul in the face with a hand fan. France used this fan incident as their excuse to launch a full-scale invasion in 1830. And despite some fierce resistance led by Emir Abdelkader, who was eventually forced to surrender in 1847 due to these brutal scorched earth tactics, France took control. But they didn't just stop at a military victory. They systematically altered the society, leading up to the enactment of the devastating Indigenous Code. Here's the crucial point. France didn't just occupy the physical land, they legally crushed the people. The Indigenous Code of 1881 officially turned Muslim Algerians into second-class citizens. Think about this. A French officer could find, imprison, or exile an Algerian instantly, with absolutely zero trial. And honestly, it gets worse, because they targeted the culture itself. The French language was imposed, and Arabic was treated like a foreign language. It was effectively banned in schools. It was a highly calculated attempt to occupy not just the territory, but the minds of the people. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, devastating poverty actually forced a lot of Algerians to migrate to France. And the contrast here is just stark. In France, they were drafted for harsh labor. They were literally building the infrastructure of the French nation, the Paris metro, the mines, the docks, yet they were denied basic rights. Meanwhile, back in Algeria, their families were being stripped of their lands and forced into hard labor. So Algerians were essentially absolute strangers in their own homeland and completely unacknowledged subjects in the country they were helping to build. Section 3. Igniting the Revolution. Let's move into the 20th century and see how decades of suppression and the broken promises of World War II finally ignited a revolution. 45,000. Let that staggering number sink in for a moment. That is the estimated number of lost in the Sétif massacres on May 8, 1945. You see, after fighting for France in World War II under the promise of independence, Algerians took to the streets to celebrate the Allied victory and basically demand their freedom. In the town of Sétif, a young man named Bouzid Saal simply raised a banned Algerian flag. A French officer shot him. The protests that followed were met with massive, overwhelming military retaliation that destroyed entire villages. It really cemented the realization that peaceful change was going to be impossible. Now, fast forward nearly a decade to November 1, 1954. The newly formed National Liberation Front, or FLN, actually offered a surprisingly peaceful blueprint for a sovereign state. Their demands were pretty straightforward. Recognize Algerian nationality, abolish the colonial laws, and negotiate with Algerian representatives. They were essentially asking for a state that respected basic freedoms. And France's response? The Interior Minister firmly declared that Algeria was France, and the only negotiation was going to be war. As the war escalated, France poured 500,000 soldiers into the conflict. But they also employed a really devastating tactic. They recruited harkis. These were Algerians who sided with and were recruited by the French military to monitor their own villages, hunt down revolutionaries, and gather intelligence. France was intentionally fracturing Algerian society, creating this heartbreaking reality where Algerians were pitted against one another. I always love explaining this next part because it shows so much resilience. Algerians realized they could fight back not just with weapons, but with their culture. Poetry, theater, and music became literal instruments of resistance. You had Mufti Zakaria writing Kasaman, a powerful poem that would become the national anthem. And at the exact same time, the local music of Oran, Rai, started evolving into this modern rebellious style. They were actively preserving their identity against a colonial machine that was designed to completely erase it. Section 4. The cost of independence. The war drags on, pushing the French Republic right to the brink of collapse, which is when General Charles de Gaulle stepped in. De Gaulle was a total master of political maneuvering. He employed this intense double strategy. To the international public, he was promising self-determination, but on the ground, he escalated military repression and troop numbers. And shockingly, while he was out there preaching peace, France was literally using the Algerian desert as a nuclear test site. Starting in 1960, they detonated 17 atomic bombs. The very first one was a 70-kiloton blast. It's a tragedy that still causes radiation and health defects for people in that region today. Eventually, sheer exhaustion forced both sides to the table for the 1962 Evian Accords. And, as you can see, justice was somewhat sacrificed for stability. It was a convoluted deal. Algeria secured a ceasefire and a path to independence, and the FLN was recognized. But France? They got to keep temporary exploitation of desert oil and gas, they kept naval bases, and crucially, they got an amnesty clause that exempted French forces from prosecution for war crimes. It was a deeply imperfect deal that ended up dividing both Algerian and French societies. Despite violent pushback from rogue French generals who literally attempted a military coup to stop all of this, the process moved forward. On July 1, 1962, the Algerian people overwhelmingly voted for their freedom. And just 2 days later, France officially declared Algeria independent. That ended 132 years of colonization. Section 5, Strangers in Two Homelands. Now, you might think the explainer just ends right here with independence, but history is rarely that clean. A whole new chapter of alienation was actually just beginning for Algerians living in France. Notice this massive jump in the numbers. Despite the brutal war, the Algerian population in France actually grew from 211,000 in 1954 to 350,000 by 1962. Why? Because hundreds of thousands of immigrants had spent years putting down roots. Their jobs, their homes, their kids' schools were all in France. Leaving for a war-torn country that was just finding its feet wasn't exactly an easy option. But by staying, they transitioned from being French subjects to being immigrants in the land of their former occupier, and they still lacked true political rights. This created a massive social rift, particularly for the second and third generations growing up in the banlieue, these marginalized suburbs on the edges of major French cities like Paris and Marseille. These kids lived a daily contradiction. They'd speak Arabic or Amazi at home and then French at school. They were completely steeped in European culture, but faced this daily street racism that constantly reminded them they weren't viewed as fully French. Yet, if they went to Algeria, they were seen as foreigners there too. They weren't fully accepted by either nation. So where does all that marginalized energy go? It pours into art. This cultural alienation fueled a massive new wave of Rai and later rap music. It blended traditional Andalusian and Bedouin heritage with modern electric guitars and heavy beats. This wasn't just party music, you guys. It became the container for immigrant anger. It was a desperate cry for identity from a youth stuck between two fires. And it's exactly the cultural force that culminated in that 1998 Bercy concert we talked about at the very beginning. But tension like that can't stay contained in music forever. In 2005, the art spilled over into reality. Following the tragic deaths of two immigrant youths fleeing the police, these marginalized suburbs literally exploded in uprisings. Cars and buildings burned for days. It was a massive wake-up call that shocked France, proving that the colonial past wasn't just buried in history books, it was a very present, unhealed wound right there in the modern streets. Impartially looking at the modern political landscape, we can see that this history remains a highly contested battleground. We still hear prominent French figures downplaying or denying the colonial past. For example, politician Jean-Marie Le Pen was quoted calling colonization a romantic comedy,
Other political leaders have even questioned if an Algerian nation existed at all before French rule. These kinds of statements just show how raw this history remains and how it continues to deepen the identity struggle for French Algerians today.
We'll wrap up our explainer today by leaving you with something to really think about. We've traced this incredible journey from a trivial fan incident in 1827 through a brutal 132-year war, all the way to the modern banlieues. We've seen how politics, war, and language can completely tear a society apart. So how do we define belonging for a generation caught in the echoes of all this history? When a homeland doesn't fully see you, and your birth country rejects you, where does your identity truly belong? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and keep questioning the history behind the world we see around us.